Well, hello there. Welcome to Robots, Detectives, and Spies. Today we're talking about Spider-Noir. Try a little bit of a different format today. Yeah, this just recently was released on Prime. I can't remember what day the 27th was, but I watched it on a Friday. And I have some mixed feelings on it. I'm not gonna call it bad. Because if we talk about, streaming shows and all that stuff, this show is probably above the average of your typical, let's say, superhero streaming show or, and, whatever. I'm not sure what even a direct point of comparison would even be. But, yeah, so I have the Rotten Tomatoes thing here. All the reviews talk about how good Nicolas Cage's performance is. This is talking a little about the stories by The Guardian here. It says there's all sorts of things happening. You got plot twists, you got hidden abilities. It is interesting though, if nothing's brilliantly innovative, which is one way of saying. I'll get to some of my own thoughts here in a second. Um, well crafted enough, damning with faint praise, adult enough, and just about original enough for reprieve. Yeah. That's just whatever. I'm looking for one particular one. So this guy, and this is kind of the funny thing with Rotten Tomatoes, you had a bunch of people saying, sort of like, it was something of a stunt, yada yada yada. And this guy is just like, oh, it's disposable, it's IP maintenance, but it's the Nick Cage hype train or whatever. So I was quite excited about this. I'd heard some good things about it, and I watch a lot of detective films. I've seen, The Maltese Falcon, The Third Man. I've seen, stuff like The Big Sleep, The Big Combo, um, Dark Passage, which is a little bit more obscure. Even stuff that's not like straight, conventional noir, like A Ministry of Fear or something like that. So, first episode in, I was pretty on board with the whole experience. A lot of stuff in the first episode. I really like the way that the cinematography looked. Let me turn the speaker off. So first episode in, I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. You got Nicolas Cage, who's usually pretty fun and stuff. You have this kind of novel where approach where you can either click to watch it in color or watch it in black and white. It's much more grounded, nor as opposed to what's more contemporary, sort of like your more flashy, hyper stylized noir, like some of the Frank Miller adaptations, like The Spirit or something, where it doesn't feel of the era. It's intentionally anachronistic, and f- for something that's gonna be more of a mash of different eras and genres, that can be interesting, but all of this is closer to what as far as a modern approximation could be. It's pretty close to looking the way things are supposed to look in terms of like, black and white cinematography and stuff. But, I was on board. I ended up watching the whole series because I figured I'd want to make a video on it about one or two episodes in. Couple of stuff I thought was kind of surprising is despite being, I don't know, it's technically a character that pre predates the movies, but despite being Nicolas Cage reprising his role from the Spider-Verse films, it's quite violent, quite a bit more adult. Not anything compared to like there's darker films from the olden times, but got quite a bit of swearing. It's all TV 14, but it's not something you would like couldn't necessarily watch with like exactly the same demographic as the movie, which is a a family film, and this is more older, you know, um, more targeted for more targeted for a more adult crowd. But which is doesn't make it bad, but there's a few episodes in there that if you have like an acrophobia, I would not recommend you watch. I can't remember specifics, but definitely episode 6, or at least the episode takes place in a hospital. So that's interesting. Um, like I said, I was mostly on board, but there's a certain point where in the story, what would be the mystery wraps up, and I'm not going to say that there isn't story to go, but the plot's not particularly complicated. And while there's definitely, you know, character development in the story, it's it's a focus, but it's not like the primary focus, but neither is your traditional like procedural elements of the plot. It kind of ends up this kind of weird middle ground. So yeah, there's some stuff about various characters have traumas and histories and all that stuff, but compared to other kind of noir inspired stuff like Daredevil or something based off of Batman or something, which in case of Batman is was written um, shortly after this series would have been set, so it's very much inspired by contemporary hard boiled crime fiction and all that stuff. But yeah, it's really let's get put bring up some of my notes here. It's very hard to explain. I think they have that term you would hear a lot that I would hear a lot in schools, like je ne sais quoi, which is that sort of hard to describe thing. I One of the things I googled right before I started recording, and this is according to the AI overview, is how many named characters die. It's about 7. A few of which are characters you would expect to die, but almost none of them are. I would say spoilers. I'll say that. But in comparison, in spoilers for all the things I'm going to bring up to comparison to some other things, like Daredevil, where you have some characters integral to the good guy team or the plot die. You have more. The relationship between characters is a little bit less tropey, genre driven, a little bit more based off of the specifics of the characters. Um, I don't know. It's tough because you have. Let's go back to the Wikipedia page here. You have you have a lot of cast. You have a lot of characters here. Like I said, Nicolas Cage is Ben Raleigh. I do love the fact that it's Ben Raleigh. I'm only really familiar with the old cartoon. I do have the comics, some of the comics there, but it's before his time. Nicolas Cage as the Spider is quite a bit of fun. He's got like a friend that is a little bit like of a reporter type, which is interesting because it kind of changes the dynamic. Like I said, all the cast they all kind of portray their characters in an interesting way. I'm kind of like it's all good performances. It's like especially like Brendan Gleeson and some of these other guys and um the aesthetic, some of even the elements of the execution is all very interesting. But what I think a lot of the why of things are happening, it's not even like all all the individual elements don't quite work together. It's just kind of a bit thin. Um, so yeah, so a lot of my interests or enthusiasm kind of waned as the episodes went on. I'm just looking at my notes here. I like the idea and some of the execution, and it would definitely be character development. Is a lot of the characters have arcs. They go on journeys. They do things. But a lot of what makes noir is yeah, you can have complicated, almost confusing plots. Like the guy with the Pass is usually an example of one that is hard to follow. The Big Sleep has some parts that aren't wrapped up towards the end of the film, like who killed who and yeah, all that stuff. But what there's a lot of very strong thematic stuff. There's a lot of noir films that don't even have detectives in them. Or they might have a detective in them, but they're more about um kind of crafting this world where fate and uh, usually characters making decisions that kind of set 'em on a path of destruction and or going up against the system or something. And while some of that's here, one reason why I was thinking about character deaths is a lot of those newer noir films you would have gone past the 70s. They have a ton of, or even say something like, which is not really a noir film, but even something like The Untouchables. A lot of the ways the mob or whatever conspiracy, um, they use a lot of violence to kind of enforce their control. A lot of times in ways that other characters in stories really don't want to, good people even really don't want to fight against the powers because of the personal cost. You have that moment in Untouchables where the guy pulls up in the car and says, it's a nice place you got here, kind of thing. Would be too bad if anything was to happen. And a lot of that's dramatized. A lot of that is, I imagine the mob in some places was less subtle, and other places had to sort of be aware of optics and all that kind of thing. But because like very few name characters die, which I'll have to say again, isn't necessarily a problem, but it does mean that if you have about, let's say, roughly seven name characters that die, one of which the AI got kind of incorrect because it's more of like a flashback thing. That means out of 8 episodes, there's like six named character devs and maybe a bunch of henchmen here or there or something like that. That means like if they go and they talk to somebody, yeah, it'll be fine. Like, they're not the consequences of a lot of stuff isn't quite there. The other thing too is, well, Spider-Man's not Superman in the sense that he's not invincible. And the character that Nicolas Cage is playing is much more of a flawed person than like conventional Peter Parker. The big issue is that there's a scene early on that basically shows that if you wanted to, at a certain point in the story, and he pretty much does, but he kind of backs off, he could take out the entire criminal organization pretty simply, and he shows up and kind of takes out a bunch of their vehicles and all that stuff. It's a fun enough scene, but it does kind of beg the question, like, well, why doesn't he do that? Like, if he knows exactly where the bad guys are, if he can deal with guns and he can deal with most normal criminal elements before other superpowered beings show up, why doesn't he just take them all out? Especially since they're wanted. In a few of them are would definitely be wanted, but yeah, it's like I guess at that particular point in the story, his actions does stop certain things from happening, which has, I guess, consequences. So I guess the villain didn't necessarily have a warrant out for their arrest or something. But typically, when you have a character that's significantly more powerful than the people they're fighting, there has to be like either they don't know who the guy at the top is, or someone like Lex Luthor or someone else is protected by laws, innocent to proven guilty, kind of a thing where they can kind of manipulate the legal system or hide behind um, image of themselves to kind of prevent someone who could take him out. When they're kind of unreachable or something like that. But Yeah, you basically pretty early on know the entire like criminal organization. Like in contrast to say something like both the audience and the main character understand who's at the top. They understand most of the main players. They understand what their business is, how they make money. There doesn't seem to be any rival gangs in the story, which might be a world building thing, but in comparison, they say something like the first season of Daredevil, where there is relative peace at the beginning, but then there's a falling out, which kind of leads to issues with Kingpin's operations. There seems to be only one group of, you know, mafia or whatever they're supposed to be in the city, and so you can't really have your. I haven't seen the newer Scarface, but like the old one where they have this giant, gang war basically. So I don't know. There's a bit of that. A lot of the tropes of you know hard boiled detective fictions here. The alcoholism, uh, the down on his luck detective. He even has stuff from like the Maltese Falcon in there. Femme Fatale. Um, like I said, trying my best to avoid spoilers. Let's see when I edit this. Um, how good I'm doing on that. Femme Fatale is interesting because she seems like a little bit of an inversion where typically there's a million ways of having femme fatales. What makes a femme fatale is that there's some sort of an attraction to usually the lead detective or the protagonist of the story, and there's an element of danger, whether just perceived because you don't quite understand their motivations, or it can be a situation where they have their own agenda. Um, in this story, early on, the agenda of the femme fatale is more clear, and then the more traumas and the vulnerability and all that stuff is brought out later, which is a spoiler. But I'll keep going on this angle for a bit, which I find to be a bit odd because usually in a story like this, a lot of a lot of times in a story like this, a character like a femme fatale would be manipulating the events of the story either in subtle ways or going out and hiring people or something like that to kind of either get themselves out of a situation or to for their own profit or their own motivation. And after it's revealed what exactly the femme fatale's goal is, it it's very the driving force of the plot are just kind of there. So you have the femme fatale's relationship to the mob boss, in this case, Silvermane, who, like I said, very good performance. Not a ton about him as a character. Um, eh, there's some stuff he says, but he's always interesting. The relationship between him and Winston's kind of interesting because Winston does speak freely, and actually, at least in the early episodes, is an interesting kind of foil. But yeah, so there's a relationship between him and Silvermane and the mayor, which is important. Um, that I don't find that compelling. In the sense that obviously yeah, corruption, all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't really lead to an all-out war between the police and the mob, or elements of the police and elements of the mob, or rival gangs in the mob, in the sense that there are maybe gangsters or that have certain parts of the police on their payroll, all that stuff, and maybe there's different lines in the sand. It's just kind of there. And you have that little bit with the superhuman story going on, which basically makes the police as a faction almost completely powerless, um, and the superhumans as a faction are um like I don't know a lot of it is sort of focused on them dying in a way that the main characters and despite having similar mutations. So yeah, I could be getting some of these details wrong because like I said, I watch all this back to back. But yeah, it, I if let's get into some of like the aesthetic stuff here and I'll kind of wrap up here. So I synced up the two different trailers and I have a few different markers here. So it's when you go on Amazon and trying to find a particular shot here. It gives you the option to either watch things in color or in black and white, which is interesting. My own personal preference would be just have it be black and white. If this was something theatrically released, which there has been a few films in the last 20, 25 years released completely in black and white, or mostly black and white with some color here and there. You can get away with it. It's something you can do. And on a streaming service, you can have two different versions. I know one of the newer Godzilla films from Japan had a release that was in black and white, so it's like it's doable. But it also affects the way you film things. So in the sense that if there were certain ways, like props and all that stuff, that back in the olden days they would pick things in terms of like grayscale rather than it being in terms of hue and contrast and all that kind of stuff. You would just be thinking purely in terms of like grayscale contrast and in terms of color. Even you could get with some different kinds of makeup that would look better for the what would register. Even certain colors were almost completely dropped by like black and white film stocks, which is how you get a lot of like compositing techniques with blue screens and all that stuff. So if they had committed to doing just black and white, they could have maybe adopted some or go back to some historical techniques. And I think as an approximation, um, is quite interesting here. Like, let's go full screen on this. It's amazing that it's not just desaturation, but you notice here, like, this is brighter in the backdrop. The sort of the shadows have been brought up, all that stuff. It's a little bit more of a gradual transition. You still have a lot of contrast in this shot, but it's not quite the um you feel like your TV isn't calibrated properly. You get it with all these shows where you just cannot see that well into the shadows. And so it looks like they definitely did a lot of the research and tried to get a decent approximation of like what an old, detective series like this would have looked like. That said though, I let's go full screen on like something real quick here. It still looks quite digital, and I'll give a point of comparison in a second here. So just in terms of like the resolution and all that stuff, they probably I would assume maybe went out and got some older lenses, maybe like 70s and back or something. But if you compare this to let's get a shot that's a little bit less contrast. If we compare this to, let's take this one here. If we compare this here, like I said, pretty similar in terms of grayscale, except for they desaturate this. If we go to say like the Maltese Falcon here, and let's go to a shot of someone talking, uh, it's obviously there's a lot of light. It's still incredibly contrasted between like the absolute black of these suits, but at the same time though the faces are fully exposed properly, like the midtones and all that stuff. And because obviously this was scanned into computer on like a digital scanner, Okay, so we hit Control F. On a digital scanner, so it's still like digital technically, but the original negatives and release prints and all that stuff were film. But
Didn't tell you what it did?
it's all this stuff
Yeah.
is much more. You can see the grain moving
Good. I've got it.
as the shots are going. It's like there's decent resolution here, but it's not the kind of grid base high res that you got going. Say with uh that's a visual effects shot.
Never.
A lot of this, it still looks very much where if like I said, like this looks like John Wick 4 or anything shot on anything relatively modern. This has a little bit of contrast. Like I appreciate that they put quite a bit of contrast. That's a little bit weird. Quite a bit of contrast here, but yeah, like it's still very 21st century digital. It could still be film. It might even be the way they filmed it, but everything's really like sharp in a way that isn't necessarily feels naturalistic. Where let's go to like man, you do still get quite a bit of, like I said, the proper amount of light on the face, um, but like the edges and all that stuff, it feels more organic in the way that you can still get this with a digital camera if you put um obviously the third man. It's an incredible looking film, but it just stuff people usually say about film that obviously I haven't shot in 35 millimeter or super 35 millimeter film is that it's a little bit kinder to skin tones and um uh, s- uh you don't have to it's kinder to the skin and all that stuff. Not necessarily skin tones, but there's a lot of contrast, but there's also a lot of light. So you do have stuff that goes absolute black all over the frame, but then you have mid tones and you have like highlights. A lot of this is, scanned into a computer, being played back on a monitor. Your setup at home is probably different than mine, so it's hard to say what things are. But it's this is a touch of evil. Remember, this is at night, and so you don't have, like I said, you have some darker stuff going towards black, but you also have highlights. You have mid-tones. Like they took all the time on a lower budget. This series, Spider-Man costs $400 million to make. Difference is, a TV show has tighter deadlines, but they basically went through and actually took the time to light all of these stage fast. I also say too, frame choice. You'll see in this trailer here, there's a lot more like close-ups and stuff, which is the reality of television. It'd be really hard to do Howard Hawks style framing where you tend to have you know the camera farther back, and sort of moving with the character.
Probed into its
As
mysteries,
this
every
trailer
clue
is
told me a
going to
different
hopefully
story.
plays
But each had the same ending.
a little bit more of the
Murder.
stage
Your
inspiration.
instinct warned me
Like once again, some of this I don't think this is the best scan in the world because you can see
to beware.
there's a lot of cleanup that hasn't been done here, but and you get the black here um of the screen. Like I said, lots of contrast, but you can still see, you know, it's there's a little bit of a nuance that's kind of missing. This is the big combo, which is another famous film for a particular shot. But like I said, you still got a lot of contrast. There's soft light. I don't know if it's balanced or for some kind of diffusion. Um, it's dark passage where, like I said, you sort of get, like I said, you can see the face, but then they also want to, got these actors on huge studio contracts. These are the people that bring people into the movie. You want to be able to see their faces as part of the brand. all that stuff. But you also get a bit of contrast, so a little bit of the face going into shadow, but it's not crazy. Where if some of these scenes which are set during the I'll say a lot of the day stuff was pretty kind of washed out. Um, to some of these things here, and it's like I get that the light source right here is being motivated by these two light bulbs, and the entire scene is like that, like maybe something like the French Connection or something. But it's a lot more moody. That's those are two different shots. Okay, that's interesting. So these trailers didn't sync up 100%. And yeah, that saturation is insane. So whoever, as a production, means they had to think in terms of this and think in terms of that, which isn't as crazy as I'm making it sound out to be. But basically, means that someone went recolor timed all this, but it also had to be shot on a day to also work in color, which is really interesting. So, like, if you're picking costumes and all that stuff, you have to be aware of all these things. Like, this is such a different vibe here versus that. Like, this could be a little bit more like Christopher Nolan y kind of whatever. And this is kind of more like it's still modern, but it does kind of pass. I think one of the things my brain would kept thinking about, like, if there was a throwback episode of like X Files or Stargate or something where they would go back to the 40s, it's kind of like that, but with like a bigger budget. But it's just you look at a lot of this stuff. You don't when you set something in the 40s, you don't necessarily need to make it look like the films of the 40s, and you have a little bit of leeway. You can even maybe make it closer, like filmed, because the cameras aren't literally there, so you could film in a variety of different ways to have something that feels authentic to the time. But yeah, we're looking at the Maltese Falcon here, and it's like
Sting.
you have a whole scene that has dialogue information into a single frame as much as they can. Some of that due to the limits of technology at the time, some of that's just taste. But it's not just a close up of a face. And of course, like I said,
You have something on me that you can use. One of the
start out with one movie to the next. Like I said, even a relatively low budget film is going to have more time per page than necessarily even a high budget television show that has a deadline. Although this show's been worked on for years at this point, but yeah, just like the third one here, so it'd be kind of actually fun to get this in 4K. But so you do obviously have stuff going to darkness up here, but you still have a lot of visual information. I think this does relatively good job not being super. I got mixed feelings about the way it looks. So we've talked a little bit about um. Okay, it's just a browser. It's looked. We've talked a little bit about the story, but if it gets a second season, that could be interesting. I think Brendan Gleeson's Silvermane was is or was a very interesting character. I guess spoiler, but I would be not opposed to watching a second season, but I just feel like you'd want it to be stronger, especially with the gimmick. The idea of having this is a show starring Nicolas Cage. He's playing Spider-Man, who's also a detective. That's really cool. But when you get to season two, it's like, all right, he's got this trauma. Some of it's from the war. Some of it's from having a loved one die. But like, that's kind of interesting. You could do another mystery. I probably would want us for this kind of character, especially a Spider-Man character, something smaller stakes, that kind of showcases this kind of alternative New York City, that had superheroes in the 30s, that had, like where he's going and interviewing people and talking to the guy that owns like a boxing rink, or figuring out if someone's fixing matches or corruption or stuff. There's a prohibition thing in here, and it's pretty lame. Like in comparison to say like the Untouchables or something, it's just a lot of the thematic. Like I said, the Untouchables is not particularly historically accurate, but just the way that it shows that kind of conflict or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't hate it, and I think that there's a lot to be said about experimentation, but I really wish that it would the way that the story told was less it's still very conventionally um it's still very conventionally Hollywood. I mean, if they made a film version of this, it wouldn't be different, which in of itself isn't a bad thing, but these older Hollywood films had both, for very pragmatic budget reasons, had the films looked a very specific way due to budget. And some of the people that made a lot of those films back in the day are very surprised that people unironically kind of embrace the look of the film. But they also were primarily like, many of them were adaptations based off of books. They had stories, they had themes, they had characters, they had um, all sorts of things to say about the world that goes beyond more of a kind of like a devil not devil Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, Roger Rabbit. um Here's our episode of the Animaniacs where we're gonna do you know the Maltese Falcon. um Obviously Roger Rabbit's well written. I mean, I've heard that it's just basically just Chinatown, but you know what I'm saying. So anyways, this has been a bit rambly. This has been a bit weird the way I formatted this, so hopefully it's somewhat coherent. So, hey, this has been Robot Detectives and Spies. Thanks for watching, and yeah, I'd say if you're at least interested in it, like I said, your mileage may vary. I didn't think it was um awful. Like Nicolas Cage gives a good performance, but yeah, um, have a good rest of your day.